When we think about the part played by the UK Parliament in the UK Constitution, it's useful to think about some categories. I think one important category is accountability for the government. Another important category is representation. And the third category I'm going to talk about is legislation. So to start with accountability, the idea of accountability is that those who hold power should in some way answer to the wider public. That's the basic principle of accountability. Within the UK system, that means that we have a government, a UK government, formed out of Parliament, which answers to Parliament. That's the basic principle, that Parliament is the source of the government and it's also the body to which the government answers. So how does Parliament go about holding the government to account? There are a variety of ways. One is questions put to ministers, or questions like questions put in the chamber, or as we've seen recently, perhaps via Zoom, but questions put by speaking, and then also written questions. There's a lot of written questions which are submitted by members of Parliament to the government, which the government answers in written form. There are also debates where different politicians, the government, opposition politicians and backbenchers, that's people who are members of Parliament who aren't senior in any of the parties, have a debate, have an argument about a particular issue. So it's another way in which Parliament holds the government to account. Another important development is over the last 40 or 45 years in the UK, which has become increasingly important, is the use of select committees. Select committees are groups of around about 12 members of parliamentarians that focus on particular policy areas and inquire into them and produce reports, taking evidence from a variety of people. And they've become quite important as a way of engaging in detailed scrutiny of particular government departments. And they're also a focus often for public coverage of the work of Parliament. So that's an important development that's taken place in recent years. And they're focused very much on policy, and that's why they're important to accountability. There are limitations to accountability. One of them is the obvious point that a government, by definition, has the support of probably a majority of MPs from a single party in the House of Commons, and therefore the extent to which that the House of Commons in particular will be really willing to scrutinise and criticise the government is limited, since the government and the majority in the House of Commons are from the same party. Also, it's important to bear in mind that because of that position, partly, the government is always in quite a strong relationship in relation to Parliament. Often it's able to get its way, it's able to get what it wants, get its business through Parliament, and it also controls a lot of the timetable of Parliament. So it's important to think that actually government's in quite a strong position, but that doesn't mean they always get what they want, and governments always have to take into account the views of parliamentarians when they're developing proposals, and they have to bear in mind in particular what people within their own party in Parliament think and take their views into account. Sometimes people within their own party will do what's known as rebelling and actually vote against them, but even without that happening, it's possible for parliamentarians to exert a lot of influence that might be unseen but nevertheless is there. So it's important to qualify this idea of government dominance. Next, we come to the idea of representation. We live in what's known as a representative democracy. In other words, we elect people who then govern on our behalf and answer to us, partly through the accountability mechanisms I was just talking about. One of the two chambers of Parliament, the House of Commons, is directly elected, We're going to talk in other parts about the means by which it's elected. But that's important because it means the House of Commons is put there by members of the public voting, and that's its source of legitimacy, and that's very important. That's how it represents. But another way of looking at representation is asking what kind of people are actually in the House of Commons. Are they like us? Do they represent the actual descriptive makeup of the UK? For instance, what's the ethnic composition of the House of Commons, or indeed the other chamber, the House of Lords? What's the gender composition? Is it as diverse as UK society? Do various different groups within UK society have people like them in Parliament? And if they don't, is that a problem? Might that be a problem? Because if there's a lack of descriptive representation, as we call it, there might also be a lack of substantive representation, by which we mean actual people in Parliament actually sticking up for that particular group, pursuing the interests of that particular group, making sure that particular group and its perspectives and its rights and its interests actually has a voice in Parliament and is actually genuinely represented. So these are all very important issues. It's fair to say that in recent years, the House of Commons has become more representative, more diverse. Various different groups do have more of a presence than they once had. There's been a shift away from white male representatives completely dominating Parliament as they might have done in the past. But at the same time, there isn't full representation that's commensurate with the actual proportion of various groups within UK society. So in the sense that the progress towards more genuine descriptive representation hasn't got all the way there yet. There's not still full equality for various different groups in terms of their presence in Parliament. Nevertheless, it's an important thing to think about, that aspect of representation. When we talk about representation as well and democratic legitimacy, it's important to bear in mind that the House of Lords is not elected at all by any means. Therefore, that's been, over the years, quite a controversial issue. There's been a lot of debate about whether an all-appointed chamber is actually legitimate. Over the years, various groups, parties, people have argued that we should move towards some system of election for the House of Lords. Others argue that to do that might be to destabilise the UK constitution, because it creates a more legitimate, more powerful force which would be a counterweight to the House of Commons and its democratic legitimacy, and could create some kind of gridlock with both houses feeling able to compete with each other and nothing getting done, and it might undermine the effectiveness of government in the UK. That's an ongoing debate, but there have been various attempts to reform the House of Lords dating back as far as more than 100 years ago, but none of them have led to the introduction of a directly elected or indirectly elected House. That hasn't happened. But that's not to say there hasn't been lots of change in the House of Lords. There has. We've introduced life peers, so that whereas once the House of Lords was almost entirely made up of people who'd inherited their place there, now they're appointed there. Before 1958, there were no women members of the House of Lords either, so that's a big change that's happened. Surprisingly late historically, you might say, that's a change. So that has changed. There has been reform, but not a shift towards a fully elected House of Lords. That's yet to happen. Maybe it never will happen, certainly hasn't happened yet. A third thing to talk about and to think about when we're analysing Parliament, the UK Parliament, is the legislative role. One of Parliament's key functions is as a producer of laws, and in the UK Constitution that's particularly important because of this concept of parliamentary sovereignty. In theory, at least, that takes precedence over any other form of law, any other principle, any other legal source in the United Kingdom. The Act of Parliament is the ultimate one in the hierarchy. It's at the top of the hierarchy. And that means Parliament is an important place, and whoever's got power within Parliament is in a strong position to produce whatever laws they want to, limited only by practical or political constraints. which actually can be very important, because although Parliament can in theory do anything, it's got this sovereignty, in practice it's not going to do anything, because there are all kinds of reasons why people within Parliament will feel restrained. Nonetheless, it means that an Act of Parliament can actually change the Constitution. So the legislative power of Parliament is very important. Now, how effectively it legislates, how well it scrutinises legislation is another question, and there's a lot of debate about that, about whether there might be better ways in which Parliament could really make sure it was legislating well. There have been various reforms introduced, like pre-legislative scrutiny, where it looks at legislation before it's introduced, and post-legislative scrutiny, where it looks at how legislation has worked out in practice. But there's still a debate about whether we need a better system of legislative scrutiny. And it's important to come back to my earlier point here about the power of the government, that most laws that get passed are initiated by the government. Some laws introduced by backbenchers, by people not in senior positions in the government, or even in the main opposition party. Sometimes they're known as private members' bills, can find their way into law, but that's normally only because the government actually decides it wants to let them through. So this dominance that in some ways government has within Parliament, doesn't get everything it wants, but in some ways it's in a very strong position, also affects the legislative programme.